course. Yeah. So there are a whole range of traditional verse forms that have come down to us through different cultures over long periods of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about those traditional verse forms. But, you know, all poetry has musical elements to it, even if there's no pattern. So what we call free verse is just a poem without a metrical pattern or a pattern of refrains. But there are forms that come to us from all over the world that have these long histories that are really interesting to me. Um, and I did want to talk a little bit about, you know, why would you bother to write in these old-fashioned traditional forms? I have always written both formal poetry and free verse poetry. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm somehow against free verse. But I think it's really important for writers to learn some of these traditional verse forms. It's sort of like painters doing a kind of internship in drawing before they, you know, it's learning your chops. It's learning some of the skills that go behind whatever makes the art form. And so I think even people who have no intention of ever publishing anything other than free verse should still try out writing in these traditional verse forms. I just think it's good for tuning your ear, because the ideal poem, if there is such a thing, should be a combination of both content and song elements. So the content is what it says, but the song elements are how it says what it says. And, you know, in an ideal world, they would be equally important. Does that make sense? And poetry and song come from the same ancient, they come from the same place in pre-written history. And those song elements are what bring the pleasure in the poem. So, and this is true in free verse as well, you know, music, language is musical. Because we have soft stresses and hard stresses, we have certain sounds. If the sounds repeat, that's pleasurable to us. We recognize it as intrinsically pleasurable. And the interesting thing about this is that you can use form to increase the pleasure of a subject matter that's already full of pleasure, like a love poem, but you can also use those pleasurable song elements to work in contrast to whatever the subject matter is. And in some ways that can make a poem that's really difficult or sad even more poignant, because you have that clash of opposites happening in the poem. Yeah, you know, traditional verse forms that most people have heard of would be things like a sonnet, maybe a sestina, a villanelle. I don't know if any of these forms are how familiar your listeners are going to be with these forms. The traditional verse form is going to have echoing. That's the nature of this. So the echo could be just a sound, like consonants, where you repeat the first sound of a word, the boy bounces the ball. Or it could be rhyme, which is an echo of the end of the word, that sound. But this is an entire line, and it's used, every line is used again and again. I find putting these together, it's like a little puzzle piece, you know. I find once I start them out, if they're working, it just almost like writes itself. If they're not working, forget it. It's never going to work. But if it's working, there's something sort of magical about what happens. And of course, since every line is used twice, you only have to write half the poem. You know, you want to pick a form that matches the content in some way. So, you know, the pantoum, I'm hoping that that repetition of the lines gives some sense of something being woven together. And in a sonnet, it's so short, but it sort of circles around. It comes back in on itself.